gaps in sport. So sport has become a real challenge, and in fact there's which I can also send through to you, and there is an article that came out of, I think, the UK, where there was, or it was Australia, but one of those big sort of inquiries into the abuse within schools and churches and all of that, that there are predators hiding within sport. We call them career offenders. And what they do is they choose jobs that give them access to children. Now, going back to the fact that everybody needs to be checked against the criminal check, the sex offenders register, the child protection register, there's all of those things that need to be put in place. But where we have a problem with coaches is coaches are not centrally registered. So we are having endless issues with coaches. So we've had coaches in all sports like swimming and gymnastics and netball and whatever, all kind of facing charges and criminal, investigations, etc. And when we ask the federations, like, yeah, can you please intervene? Oh, no, they're not registered with us. So, but how can they coach? Oh, no, they don't have to register. So now, a coach can come because a coach is like, you take the part-time boys high case, he comes in as a water polo coach and a pastoral care person and a hostel master, etc., simply because he was at the school and he was a good water polo player. So he's an old boy, he was a talented water polo player, but has no qualification, skill, regulation relating to him being able to coach children. So they're not centrally registered. There is no central register of coaches. And in fact, even if they are registered with the federations, we don't really know what the federations do about the registrations because they're registered to teach sport. That doesn't mean they have any knowledge whatsoever around child development, child safety, child protection, which they're obviously trying to introduce now, but certainly doesn't exist on a large scale and certainly hasn't existed in the past. So the idea that a coach is not registered with a central authority like a SACE, where there's a minimum sort of minimum standard or a minimum framework for these young, or not always young coaches, but for coaches who then want to come and coach, is a problem. So what we do is we look at the spirit of the registration. So the spirit of the SACE registration is if you are registered with the Council for Educators, you have an education qualification, whether you teach in an IEB school or a Cambridge or a DBE school or whatever, you need to be registered with SACE. And my assumption is that you are taught to work with children, you taught pedagogy, you taught child development, you taught all of those things, and then you teach a subject. So the sport is not relevant. The baseline qualification for me is what I look for, which is a child development, a child safeguarding, a registration and a regulation baseline for employing people. And young people do need to, or not even young people, people need to be given an opportunity to get their CVs up to date in a CPD kind of context to be able to meet those requirements. We obviously don't want to exclude people because now we've made new rules. But for me, child development and child protection are absolutely critical, and the fact that you are not on any of the registers is critical, and the fact that you have some formal qualification to look at how to teach sport, for example, following the recent debates on the detrimental nature of the early specialization in sport, where coaches are being forced to do super specializations because the parents are asking the coaches to specialize their child because they want the next Wimbledon champion, but that's not in a child's best interest. So there's all of that complexity around sport and the meaning associated with sport. Okay. Now, SASCOC has a safeguarding committee, which technically you can refer to, but that having been said, SASCOC is SASCOC and only regulates Olympic sports. That's the first thing. And secondly, they seem to have very limited powers because they need to give opportunity to the federations to deal with things, because the federations, particularly the Olympic federations, are registered with international federations. For example, swimming is also FINA, and FINA has rules, and the International Organizing Committee has rules, and so it's a bit of a drama, and the short end of it is they're not very helpful. So you need to regulate it within your school context, because school sports falls between some weird categories. And for me, it needs to be regulated like we regulate educators. They should not be an exception to the rule. We can't register coaches with SACE because there's no category, although we're fighting for there to be one, there isn't one. unless, of course, they're a teacher as well. So that's the problem. And then there's the opportunities we have to make our sport safer within our schools. Obviously, there is political will by our government. You know, the president has his 5-point plan. We have the 16 days of activism against against gender-based violence coming up, which is an opportunity to land messages around grooming, gaslighting, how to protect children, how to make sure that there's safety. For example, on the child principles, where there's never one coach, there's only 2 coaches. If there are individual lessons being given, how is that managed? Things like WhatsApp groups, there shouldn't be a lot of current cases. And we had a conviction of one in George where he was a pastor and the rugby coach and the Afrikaans teacher and the art teacher, and he was found guilty of grooming based on a set of WhatsApps he sent. Now, I should never have been sending individual children WhatsApps. The parents shouldn't have allowed that. The parent is the one who needs to make arrangements around sport, and the school should never have allowed that, because he's an employee of the school there should be someone moderating communication. So young people need to know that, parents need to know that. So there's all that stuff that we can land. Things like parents watching sport, they should have a code of conduct themselves. So where my daughter was at school, she played first team netball, her boyfriend played first team rugby, and we as parents got a code of conduct from the school saying this is what is expected of you and your behavior on the sideline, and should you choose to behave badly, we'll send you home. And we won't allow you on the sidelines anymore, which I thought was fantastic, because the parents' behavior can be equally abusive and problematic on the sidelines. So essentially, there's a lot of will around getting this stuff spoken about and getting it out into the public consciousness. So what do we start with? Well, we start with the minimum standard, which is the document I'll send, and which is the stuff you have to do and you have to know. So that's protection under our law. The second is what we're moving towards within the sporting fraternity. We are working with SASCOC and with Unicef, and with, for example, gymnastics and swimming and baseball and cricket and rugby, and there's a few that have really sort of tried to come on board quite nicely. And that is a combination of the sexual abuse and harassment policy of the Department of Basic Education, which is easily available online, and it deals with all the issues. So it deals with SACE registration, SACE code of conduct. It deals with Section 17 offences in terms of the Employment of Educators Act, relationships between educators and learners, relationships. And now this idea, which we've seen in the cases that have been all over the media and the suicides that we've seen recently, is educators or coaches or both resigning while under suspicion. So it will tell you about Section 14 of the Employment of Educators Act, which will say that you need to charge people up front in terms of the discipline, not have discussions with them, because then they resign and you can't do anything with them. Whereas if in terms of section, I think it's 14(1)(d) of the Employment of Educators Act, if somebody resigns while having been charged under investigation, that charge follows them, it doesn't disappear. So that is the departmental baseline, and that applies to IEB and Cambridge and whatever. And for me, our coaches need to be governed within that context, okay, including club coaches, but slightly more complex, because schools at least have some leeway to impose things on the employees, where the clubs they are so much more difficult to regulate. But they should still, for me, act in the spirit of the fact that we need to have a certain kind of person working with children. And the sporting gold standard is the Unicef Safeguarding Guide. So what Unicef has done with the International Organizing Committee and with sort of the federations is they have issued a international safeguarding guide, particularly for Olympics. And there's about 40 hours of lectures on it online on the International Olympic Organizing Committee from the London Olympics, where they said these are the things we need to look into to keep sport safe. So that safeguarding guide is downloadable. It is completely amendable, and it is meant to be made relevant to your context. But it's a very nice template, and it's an international standard. So it takes into consideration all the international stuff, whereas the minimum standard, which I will send you, and the DBE policy take into consideration our law, as I've explained it to you, plus the law of the department that governs your registration as a teacher, doesn't govern your registration as a coach, and governs the employment of an educator, which doesn't govern the employment of a coach. But within your contracts of employment with your coaches in the sport context, you can include those things because they're your content, they are your contracts with your coaches. So essentially, what we are looking at is we are looking at communicating the fact that people who choose jobs with children can sometimes choose those jobs to gain access to them, which is career offenders. We need to be warning educators, coaches, parents, and young people about grooming. We need to be putting in place boundaries to make sure that the boundaries remain professional and don't sort of blur over into the personal. And we need to be putting processes in place that if something goes wrong, how do we deal with them? And that as a system is sort of a kind of like a nurturing care framework. It's a care framework that says sport is potentially so wonderful for children and offers such wonderful opportunities for them. However, there is a level of socially sanctioned deviance in sport that we need to guard against. Boundaries are easier to blur. People change in change rooms. Coaches walk through change rooms. Coaches get in the water in water polo when they shouldn't be getting in the water. They will teach children to cheat by grabbing, like happened in the Parktown case, by grabbing one another's penises underneath the water, and that puts your opponent off, you know, initiation rituals of rubbing deep heat on boys' penises because that, for some reason, is some kind of initiation ritual. Those are sexual assault, and we need to deal with them as assaults on the sexuality of developing young people, and particularly boys, because boys, there is a massive disincentive to disclose abuse as a boy. Are you, do they see you as gay? Cowboys don't cry. Why did he choose me? Why didn't I fight back? I should have fought, etc. And within that context, you develop a big sort of level of secrecy, and the secrecy is the power behind the abuse. Bearing in mind that doesn't exclude girls from the danger. And I mean, one of the things I heard a little while ago was, oh no, we're keeping our girls safe. We're only putting female coaches on the bus with the girls. Now that means absolutely nothing whatsoever, because one of the cases I'm dealing with in another Joburg religious school is a coach who's a female teaching, coaching young girls and having sexual relationships with the girls. So the gender creates a particular sort of bias because of the gender dynamic. Some people suspect men with girls more than boys with boys. Boys don't want to talk, and girls women who are coaching girls aren't seen as being a risk, whereas they are. So it is a percentage game, of course, and obviously is mostly men abusing mostly children. So I'm not saying that that is not the case. I'm just saying that don't assume that because you change the gender, everything is fine. Thank you.